Okay, this is 5.2, Storing Memories. The objective for today is that students will be able to outline the principles that underlie effective storage of memories. So the important part here is going to be the effective storage of memories, because sometimes we store memories and it's not always effective, right? So how does storing memories work? Well, when we store memories, there are actual synaptic changes. So there are actual brain changes whenever we have a new memory. We first discovered this with the use of sea slugs. What we found with sea slugs is that because sea slugs are very similar as far as, or have similar neurons to us, is that whenever they learned something new, they released serotonin. So there was an increase in serotonin in sea slugs. What this has helped us to understand is what we call long-term potentiation. Long-term potentiation is a lasting strengthening of synapses that increases neurotransmissions. And you're going to see an example of that right off to the right here in both of these pictures. So what we notice is that this right here is what before learning occurred. And what we see here, this is actually a electron microscope image of a neuron. This is one synapse. Then what we saw was learning occurred, or a memory. So we stored something. That same exact neuron now has two synapses. So this is after the memory. Now this is super cool because it shows that your brain actually increases the synapses as you've learned something or as a new memory gets stored. Therefore, your brain is actually getting bigger because of the changes in the neurons or the changes in your synapses. So, is there a way that we can make this happen other than storing new information? Like, what about people that are suffering from something like Alzheimer's disease? Well, what we found out with people with Alzheimer's disease is that if there would be a way that we could either increase what we call the CREB protein, that can help increase neural firing. Which could decrease Alzheimer's disease ultimately. The same thing with glutamate. If we could somehow figure out how to increase the glutamate of it, we would also find that it would increase long-term potentiation. Now, the problem is discovering a way to do this. So how do we do this? With minimal side effects. And they have not discovered that yet, which is why they don't use that, right? So that's what scientists and researchers are trying to figure out right now. Stress hormones and memories. So what we found out is when you are under a lot of stress, it is going to trigger your amygdala. Once your amygdala is triggered, there is a focus on what we would consider maybe traumatic or your stressful memories. And there is a decrease in the storage of neutral events. So when you're under a lot of stress, you are more likely to remember things that are maybe like traumatic or super eventful, and you are less likely to remember the neutral things. So like maybe what you were wearing that day. What we know about traumatic events is that if traumatic events can trigger stress-related diseases. And what we found is if people take or are given a drug called propranolol, which lessens the stress hormones, you are less likely to have a stress-related disease. So they did a trial with giving people this drug after they were raped or after they were in like severe car accidents, and they found that people that took the drug had no impact of stressful diseases versus those who did not take the drug. Flashbulb memories is when you have a very detailed memory of an emotional event. We tend to think of things like 9/11 or, JFK's assassination. So those would be what we consider flashbulb memories. If you were to ask somebody where they were on September 11th, they could probably tell you within detail. Now, what we did find is that these can be inaccurate, especially if they hear about the event and didn't witness it. So, for example, those of us that were just heard or watched on TV what happened with September 11th versus people that were actually in New York City and saw it happen or were around the Pentagon and saw it happen are going to have different memories of those events. Now, what we did find is that people who are under prolonged stress had corroded neural networks, so they actually had what we might consider smaller parts of the brain especially the hippocampus. So think about like people that are, in combat, especially. This could help explain things like PTSD. Implicit versus explicit types of memories. So within long-term memory, there are two types. There's explicit memory. Explicit memory is what we call declarative. You need to know both of these terms because they will use them interchangeably. This means that we have conscious recall, meaning that you are using effort to remember. So think of like a test, right? You're using effort to remember that memory. This is all happening in the hippocampus part of your brain. Within the hippocampus, these are general facts, so things you learn in school. And personally experienced events. So maybe think of things like if you go to like a play, right? Now, the other type of long-term memory are things that you're not as aware of, and this is what we call implicit, meaning without conscious recall. You just know it. Don't have to think about it. This is processed by other parts of the brain, including your cerebellum. So think cerebellum helps deal with movement. Okay, most of you have probably been walking for a long period of time now. You can walk without having to think about it. That's part of your long-term memory. At one point in time, you had to learn how to do that. So these are skills, motor and cognitive. Or if you play a sport, okay, you don't have to think about every play anymore or every movement. Okay, this also is classical conditioning. So reflex responses. Now, to focus a little bit more on the two parts of the brain that focus on memories, we're going to take a look at your hippocampus. So again, the hippocampus is responsible for explicit memories. It's located in your, oh, sorry team, let me erase that. Boop, 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 there we go. Okay, it's part of your limbic system. The second part is your cerebellum. And that is going to be implicit. So one might be movement. And this is how we store information. The next lesson is going to focus on how we retrieve the information.